Hi, it's Dennis Daly. Many years ago, I was watching American movie classics, and they ran a repeat of the old This Is Your Life series, and the person being honored was Roy Rogers. At the end of the show, his 10-year-old son, Dusty, came out. I turned off the TV, called the Roy Rogers Museum in Victorville, California, and heard, "Dusty Rogers speaking." He had changed a lot since the 1950s. I went to the Roy Rogers Museum, it's not there anymore, in Victorville, California, and talked to son of Roy Rogers, Roy Rogers Jr., Dusty Rogers, about the museum.
We're about 95, 98 miles outside of L.A. right now. This is what they call a high desert area. We're about 3,000 foot elevation on Interstate 15 going toward Las Vegas. We're about an hour an hour and a half outside of L.A. Dad did a few pictures here years ago, but most of them were shot at the Iverson Ranch and at Corriganville, which is down in the San Fernando Valley. Mm-hmm. And then as more and more people moved into the area, the farther out they had to get shots that didn't have phone poles and and cars going across the background. But
there's the classic story, I think, when they were filming Spartacus. If you know where to look in one place, you can see a jet plane going over.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's all things that you have to watch when you're making movies. And of course, in the old days, back in the 40s and 50s, what I call the old days is filming the television series and things. You didn't have too much of that to worry about the farther you got out. But now it's really difficult to find those locations.
Well, and even here in Victorville, going out to the Apple Valley Airport to pick up some friends today, that's almost becoming urban sprawl. And I guess as little as 10 or 15 years ago, you could have filmed a Western out there almost.
Oh, definitely. We've been here now in the high desert 27 years. We had the museum was about a 9,000 foot building in Apple Valley that we built. It was there 9 years, and it's been here 17 years. So we've had a museum almost as long as we've been up here.
I guess any Hollywood star, and certainly in the case of Roy and Dale, you have two Hollywood stars, collect a lot of memorabilia. I really feel, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, that the public almost deserves this, because Roy Rogers, Dale Evans had a certain aura where you felt you knew them. We were talking before we started the interview, the fact that when I was a kid, if I did not get to go to the Saturday matinee to see the Roy Rogers Writers Club, I cried. I mean, it was like this was a buddy of mine, a family I wanted to go visit. So making it accessible like this is really great for the public.
Well, Dad thought it was important enough. He started back in 1930, they were doing a show in San Bernardino, he and the Sons of the Pioneers. They were doing a show for the Salvation Army, and they on that same show was Will Rogers. And then they got to talking about this airplane and all this stuff, and of course the next week Will Rogers was killed in a plane crash in Point Barrow. And so Dad had heard they turned his place into a museum, so he says, I'm going to go out and see it. So he got on his motorcycle and ran out there, and all they had was a pair of boots and a saddle and he thought, gee, it'd be nice if I ever make it in this business of show business. He said, I'm going to save everything and someday have a museum, because, yeah, you're right. I think the people do deserve this, because this is a very personal museum. It doesn't have a bunch of things that are just things. These are things that belong to Roy and Dale.
Well, the first thing you see when you walk in behind a case here is Roy, high school age, back in the 30s. I love this wonderful picture of him with his prize-winning 4-H pig. I mean, what other Hollywood star would admit that he used to groom a pig?
Right. Well, Dad was a 4-H'er in those days, and he says that it was the 4-H and Guy Bumgarner who saved him from being a juvenile delinquent. I think it gave kids something to do, and so he raised this prize pig. He won first prize at the Ohio State Fair, and he went on he got to go to the state capitol, boy, and he got to ride up and down on an elevator. He'd never seen an elevator before, so he spent the whole first day going up and down. But Martha Washington was his prize pig.
Wow. And Leonard Sly, was the original name.
Yeah, his real name is Leonard Franklin Sly, and thank God he changed it. I'd have been Leonard Sly Jr., and that would have been a real drag.
So the family grew up in southern Ohio, I believe along the Ohio River, very Scotia County, if I'm not mistaken, someplace down there. Scioto County,
right.
In the very extreme southern part of the state. It was hard times. His dad, I think, worked in a shoe factory at one time.
Right, and Dad also worked there when he got old enough to tie on a work apron, and both of them worked for the United States Shoe Company in Cincinnati.
Well, to tell us, if you will, how the family made the transition. Was one family member move west first, and then the rest of the family came out, I know from seeing pictures, almost as if grapes of wrath with everything piled on the old car.
Right. Well, Mary, Dad's older sister, had moved out here. She had married, and they moved to California, and they'd been out here a few years, and Dad was working at the shoe factory, and my grandpa was working at the shoe factory, and they just got tired of sewing shoes together, and well, we used to call him Pop. My grandfather came to Dad and said, "Hey, son," he said, let's quit our jobs here and let's go out and visit Mary in California. So that's when they made their first trip out here. And of course, it was during the Depression, 1929, 1930, when the bottom fell out of everything, and Dad had saved up about $90 to make the trip, and they came out, and that's what's, and then he went back. Dad hitchhiked back home the next year, and they came back out permanently. Then he moved back out.
Now, this is a picture of Roy and his first wife, Arlene, and Arlene is your mother, right?
Right. Yes, Arlene.
She died very shortly after you were born.
About 4 days after I was born from a blood clot. In those days, they didn't get the moms up and walk them around like they do today, and they don't have the medications to thin the blood. So she had a blood clot, and it went to her brain and caused her to pass out over the bed, and then before they could even get to her, she was gone.
So here your dad, first child born, times are tough, it's the Depression, now has an infant son, and his wife is gone. I guess largely was it for a while your grandparents then who really came through? Were your grandparents out there then to help? How did that fall into place?
Yeah, my grandparents were there. Both sets were there. I had of course my mother's parents were living out. They used to live in Roswell, New Mexico, and they came out. But at that time, Dad had 3 children. He had Cheryl, my oldest sister, was adopted because they didn't think my mother could have any kids. And then about 4 or 5 years later, along came my sister Linda, and then I came along about 3 years later. So Dad had instant family there, ready to go. And then of course he married Dale a year and a half after, when I was about a year and a half old. So.
But he had met your mother when they were on tour, right? The family baked a pie, had them over for supper. Isn't that the way?
Right. Dad was, of course, times were tough in those days, and Dad was in Roswell, New Mexico, doing a barnstorming tour down through there, and every time they got a chance to be on a radio station or radio show, they would always get in the fact that, boy, we sure like fried chicken, or boy, we sure like lemon pie, and hopefully that somebody would come and bring them something to eat, and that usually happened. It worked real well, and my mother called in and said, if you'll sing Pioneer Mother of Mine, she says, my mom and I'll bring you lemon pie down, and they did. Right after the show, they had 2 lemon pies, and Dad and the Pioneers inhaled it, and then they became friends, and they started writing each other, and every time Dad would come through Roswell, he'd stop and see her, and then push came to shove, and they ended up getting married.
Well, Dusty, let's move on a little bit here, because this early period we could spend a lot of time on, but you mentioned the Sons of the Pioneers. I guess Tumbling Tumbleweed is the song everybody associates with them, but your dad really then started out getting into show business and touring as just a member of that musical group.
Right, he was a member of several musical groups, but the Pioneers was the one that he started, along with Tim Spencer and Bob Nolan, because Dad sang with the International Cowboys and the Old Bar Old Cowboys and several different groups before he actually formed the Sons of the Pioneers. But that was the first group. It started in 1931, and it's still going today. Sons of the Pioneers are still around. Of course, Dad's the only original one left. All the rest of them have passed on.
Let's move on further into his career. There's a whole section of pictures of Roy growing up and the kids in the beginning. You mentioned the fact that it began to be a complicated family. I've always thought that for a person who wanted to keep a family tree, the Roy Rogers family would require a lot of asterisks to get it all straightened out.
Right. The last, we call it the his and yours and us'ns and ourns family, because we kind of I have adopted sisters and brothers. I have foster sisters and brothers, and so it's quite a wad. We had 9 kids at home at one time. We've lost 3. There's 16 grandchildren and 27 great-grandchildren, and I think 1 an oven. So it's quite a wad.
We've gotten into some pictures of Dale Evans here, and I guess until I saw that special on American Movie Classics, I wasn't really aware of the singing career that Dale Evans had, and I guess I thought of her as always being Mrs. Roy Rogers. You know, she was always there, and kind of in that tradition of Jack Benny and Mary Livingston. They were married, but they weren't married, and in some of the movies they were. You know, it got to be a complicated kind of thing. But there's just some gorgeous pictures of her in a whole different career that a lot of people don't know about.
Well, it was early career. Again, she was struggling like Dad was. She started out as a secretary and worked as a secretary for a long time. But her first love was always singing, and she was always clowning around at home. And their mom always said, "Well, you ought to try to get work in radio." So that's what she did. She started working as a secretary to a guy who owned a radio station, and she got a chance to sing. Kind of went on from there, and she ended up singing in Chicago at the Blackstone Hotel and several others. She sang with Anson Weeks Orchestra, and really she started on WFAA in Dallas.
Let me get into one area here. Something else on the special that was brought out was the fact that one of the children had Down syndrome. That was Robin, not expected to live. The family decided, let's make this child as much a part of the family as we can, as long as the child is with us. Something that really touched me was the fact that after Dale wrote the book, and the name I can't remember.
Angel Unaware was the name.
Angel Unaware. That suddenly when they would go out to do rodeos and concerts, people were no longer ashamed to bring their children who were retarded in. And I thought that was a very moving kind of thing, that actually they had really broken a lot of ground in that area.
They did, because the kids in those days, of course, Down syndrome really wasn't understood at that time. They didn't really know what happened to the children, why they were that way. And so a lot of the parents were either ashamed of the way the child would act or in public, so they would sometimes put the child in institutions or keep them locked up. And so when Mom wanted to make this child a part of the family and out as much as possible, she decided that the book was necessary, and so she wrote it and had a difficult time with it, but she did finish it, and it helped a tremendous amount, because then we did start seeing more and more Down syndrome children out.
I know also you went through a litany of things, almost to the extent of being comedic, about how being raised as Roy Rogers' son. You had the Roy Rogers alarm clock, you slept in the Roy Rogers bed, on the Roy Rogers blankets and everything. Was that an exaggeration, or were you really the prime user of all of this merchandising?
Oh, it's no exaggeration. We had Dad had over 400 products on the market at one time, and all of those products were sent to us. I mean,
you could almost do a museum on the products.
Right. We had everything. I mean, you name it, any kind of clothing item, a toy item, breakfast food, everything all came to us to try out. So it wasn't an exaggeration. We had Roy Rogers everything when we were kids.
Is there anyone my age who did not own at least a Roy Rogers cap gun at one time?
I would think not. That was a prized item. If you could get a set of cap guns in those days, you were really in tall cotton.
Over here is a picture of someone who, as a child, I just loved. I never met Gabby Hayes. I've been told that in real life he was the same sweet, wonderful guy. I just think George Gabby Hayes was one of the spiffiest people who ever lived, and the chemistry in the ensemble company was just wonderful.
Oh yeah, Gabby was. A lot of people don't know that Gabby was actually a Shakespearean trained actor. He worked in New York for years on the stage, doing during King Lear and all of those real good Shakespearean plays in those days. And he drove around in a real nice Lincoln Continental, and he had a dapper suit all the time, and he wore a derby hat. But when he took his teeth out and started playing Gabby, he became a total different character than he was in real life. But as far as his demeanor goes, he was a terrific. He was like everybody's grandpa would. You'd expect your grandpa to be like.
That's what I was going to ask. I had heard that your dad really had thought of him as being the uncle, another member of the family, just an older fellow who was always there to help him.
He was a member of the family. In fact, after his wife passed away, and And he just kind of got down on himself. He really didn't care to live or do much anymore. Dad called him one day and said, "Yeah, Gabby, why don't you come out for Thanksgiving dinner?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know, Buck." He says, "I don't think I want to come out." And Dad went and got him, and he was, of course, laying in bed, and he was feeling down and sorry. And finally, Dad started talking baseball with him and got him up. And next thing you know, he's up walking around. Dad said, "Well, come on to dinner." So we were sitting around dinner, and we were all holding hands saying grace. And when we got done with grace, we all looked up, and Gabby just had big tears coming down his face. And Dad said, "What's the matter, Pap?" And he says, "Well," he said, "Roy, do you realize how lucky you are to have family?" Because Gabby never had any. He never had any children at all. But so I think he kind of took on the nation's kids as part of his own.
There's something else, too, in these modern times when our heroes seem to have feet of clay. I mean, whether it's, not to mention too many names, but Jim Bakker, the evangelist, so many people, particularly senior citizens, had faith in him, and then you find out things aren't really like that. You hear stories about a lot of people in Hollywood who really didn't have the kind of private life that their public life would indicate. It's refreshing to see this family kind of oriented thing in which you just feel not only welcome, but it has, I hate to say squeaky clean, but I mean that in a complimentary sort of way. It feels very clean.
Well, Dad felt an obligation to the kids. A lot of kids during those times, and when the movies were so well received, was during wartime, and there was a lot of the fathers that were gone, and so Dad felt a genuine love and trust from children. And when you're loved and trusted by children, you have to give them that certain something that they don't get elsewhere, and he's remained steadfast to that down through the years. It's very, very, very important to him that he keep that.
Well, there's a corner here in the museum that I find refreshing. I've often wondered if there was a rivalry between your dad and Gene Autry, for example, but I see a picture of them together. And not only that, there's memorabilia from other Western stars. William S. Hart, a lot of people might not know the name, but he was the quintessential silent era movie star. I don't see Tom Mix. He was the one that no matter how many times he fell. Do we have Tom Mix in here? Oh, okay. Tom Mix and his hat. Every time he fell off his horse, I was going to say, when they cut to the other camera, he had his hat back.
Oh, yeah.
Never lost the hat.
Well, there was a rivalry that the studio created between Gene and Roy because they were, number one and two in box office all the time. So they always had like there was a conflict between them. But Dad says, heck, I never even got to see Gene very often. Once in a while, they used the same film crews. When Dad was on location, Gene was in the studio, and when Gene came in to do the studio, Dad was on location, and they used the same crew. So they were always running into each other once in a while, but no, there was never any major rivalry between the two at all.
Dale made the comment in that special from Republic Pictures that Republic Pictures itself, because it was that out in the valley kind of underdog that was cranking out so much stuff very efficiently with fewer people than MGM would even consider using for a Western, was itself rather a family.
It was a very close family. They stayed. In fact, Dad had a party at his house here a few years back and invited every cameraman, sound man, and everybody they could find that worked on his pictures. So, yeah, they were very much a family. You had to be because you worked together from sun up to sundown every day for 6 and 7 days a week.
You didn't like the people, you were in trouble.
Yes, very much so.
Dusty, as we move to other parts of the museum, and literally we could spend half a day here, you have a lot of stuffed animals, antelope from Africa. How does this all fit into the picture?
Well, Dad likes to call them mounted instead of stuffed. Years ago, they used to stuff animals. There's several of those in the Smithsonian, but now they mount them. They use fiberglass molds and they're mounted, and that's the way Trigger is now. Trigger's mounted. Dad made 3 trips to Africa on safari, and all of the animals are represented here. And it's nice that children can come in and see animals that they would not normally get a chance to see. A lot of times you might be able to see them in a zoo, but a lot of times no. So Dad felt it's important that the animals be put here.
Now, I hope this doesn't sound like too naive a question. But here we have behind glass, Bullet and Trigger, not stuffed, but mounted. You spent so much time close by those 2 animals. Do they look the same in the state? Is it kind of spooky for you to see them there? At first, I'm sure you're used to it now, but...
Well, at first it was kind of hard to take but Dad says, he was a member of the family, and he says, I just can't take and put him in the ground, let the worms eat him up. He says, I've got to have him up where people can see him and appreciate him. So I don't know if I know it wasn't the very first horse that was ever mounted, but Dad says, I just couldn't bury him. And of course, Trigger was 33 years old when he died, so that's real old for a horse, So, and Dad did all 188 pictures and TV series with him, and he says, I just couldn't.
Now, there was no stunt double for the horse. I mean, Trigger was there.
We had Trigger, and then there was another horse that they used sometimes called Little Trigger, who was a little smaller in stature. And Little Trigger would be used in any time there was a real dangerous scene, if there was jumping from a cliff into the water, or if there was a whipping scene where the bad guy would get Trigger by
Trigger did have a stand-in
and whip him and whip and stuff. Now, Little Trigger understood the whip and it didn't bother him, but if you'd have hit Trigger with one, he wouldn't have known what and so he might have gone the other way. Trigger was a stallion too, so they had to keep him under wraps a little bit, because he understood Dad and he understood the commands, but he didn't like somebody else messing with him. So a lot of times they had to bring in one where there was a dangerous scene.
This may amaze some people, but even being from farm country in Indiana, I've never ridden a horse. And I've always been scared standing next to them how big they are. But once you get to know a horse, the relationship between your dad and that animal must have been, it had to be this instant kind of communication to get him to do all of that.
Oh yeah, well, Dad, the Trigger was the third horse he ever got on. They brought a bunch of the cast horses to the studio one day, and they said, we need to pick you out a horse. Well, Hoppy had a white hat horse, and a lot of the ones had different color horses, and he says, I've got to have something that's a little different. And Trigger was the only Palomino there, and he got on him. He was the third horse he got on, and he says, I rode him to the end of the lot, and he said he would turn around he'd turn on a dime and give you 9 cents change. And he says, we just fit together so well. He says, this is the one I want. So.
And I guess it was rough, you said, on you, of course, but on your dad when Trigger died peacefully, I suppose?
Oh, yeah, they turned him out. In fact, Dad got a call in the morning, about 5 o'clock one morning, and it was Dan from the ranch, and Dad says, you don't have to tell him. He says, Trigger's gone, isn't he? He says, yeah. Oh. And he said, how did it happen? He said, well, he just let him out, and he went out and ran around the paddock about 3 times and reared up and kind of sat down and munched a little grass and then just laid down and had a heart attack and passed away.
Wow.
So, but we didn't even know about it for a year. He didn't want to tell anybody that he was gone. So.
Thank goodness. Well, where can we go on a happier note?
Well, we can...
I'm a sentimental fool.
That's buttermilk.
Oh, sure. Let me ask, as we're walking here, I always remember that wonderful phrase that the announcer, and I can't remember who the announcer was for the weekly television show. Oh, I'm sorry. The weekly television show, and his comical sidekick, Pat Brady.
Well,
was Pat one of the sons of the Pioneers at one time?
Pat took Dad's place when Dad left the Pioneers. The Pioneers were under contract with Columbia, and when Dad had a chance to sign with Republic, he left the Pioneers to be able to sign with Republic. The Pioneers were still under contract with Columbia Pictures, and they were still doing Charlie Starrett movies and things like that. Mm-hmm. So Pat Brady took Dad's place with the Sons of the Pioneers. So, yeah, he was with them from early on.
And here's the Jeep Nellybelle.
Yeah, we got Nellybelle in here. Can't have a Roy Rogers story without Nellybelle.
And then behind it is the car that the Rogers, the Sly family moved out west in. And I remember in that old This Is Your Life segment, Ralph Edwards saying that your dad had told him that he really started crying the hardest when he saw the old car brought out.
The old car and his mom, yeah, that would do it. But this is the old Dodge that came in. This is 1923 Dodge, and it used to be a sedan. They cut the back of it off and made a flatbed out of it so they could haul all their stuff, and they hauled a trailer behind it. And they came out across the old washboard 66 all the way out to California.
As we go past the area and come closer to modern times, I want to bring up the fact how worried a lot of us were about a year ago when Dale was so sick. I saw her a few minutes ago. She looks well. I think those of us who were kind of distant from that really weren't hoping for the worst, but it certainly turned out well.
Yeah, she was very, very ill. She had a heart attack on Mother's Day of last year, and of course she came through it very, very well. The good Lord decided it wasn't time to take her yet. But we did almost lose her. It was a nip and tuck there for a while.
Trigger Jr., tell us about this horse.
Trigger Jr. was the one that Dad would take on the road a lot to state fairs and rodeos because he's the one that learned all the dance routines. He would do the karaoke and the rumba. He had about 40 different dances that he could do on command, and so he's the one that Dad took and did all of the fancy routines in the middle of the rodeo arenas.
Now, up here on the wall, you have a blow-up of the sheet music of Happy Trails, and Dale wrote that, right?
Yeah, she wrote that in 1951. They were just still doing their radio show, and they felt that, Dad always used to sign many Happy Trails Roy Rogers, and so they thought, well, you need a trail song. You can't be a cowboy and not have a trail song. So Mom, just before the show one time, wrote this little song up, and Pioneers did it, and of course it's been around for many years.
I guess I'm not the only person who went to a high school where on what we called senior night, which was a less formal final goodbye to our parents, we sang Happy Trails at the end of it. I presume a lot of people have done that.
Right. Well, it was a very popular song. It still is today, and it's probably one of the most recorded songs. I think the last time we checked it, it had been recorded by over 400 different artists. So.
Wow. Also, I didn't mention as we were passing by, but there's also a section there paying tribute to Native Americans, which certainly makes me feel good considering the fact that a lot of early Westerns were rather misdirected.
Well, I think Dad's been made honorary tribe member of just about every tribe in the world because of the fact he was one of the first cowboys to show Indians in a good light, treated them fairly and showed them that they weren't all warring, that they were peaceful, loving people, land-loving people, and so of course he's part Indian himself. He's part Choctaw Indian. His great-grandmother was full-blooded Choctaw Indian. So
just being from Ohio doesn't mean you can't have Choctaw Indian. We forget about that.
Yeah, we do. But the Indians, were here long before we were, and of course they interracial marriages a lot in those days.
Okay, I think we're doing fine. I don't want to hang you up more than. These are photographs, right?
Oh, these are
of the Walk of
Fame.
Okay.
Stars, yeah.
On the way out, let me ask about these photos here. These are actually letting us see that downtown in Hollywood, the family's represented on that famous Walk of Fame.
Yeah, at least 6 times. Mom has 2 stars, and Dad, I think, has 4. He has one for radio, one for television, one for recording, and I believe the other one is motion picture. So he's got 4, and Mom has 2.
Now, I mentioned how complicated your family tree is. I did not see this on the way in, but there is drawn on the wall a tree. Right. And tell us where some of the kids are now.
Well, like I said, we had 9 kids. We had 4 adopted, 1 foster child in the family. Most all of them live relatively close by. My sister Dodie, of course, lives in just about 60 miles from here in Quartz Hill, Palmdale, Lancaster area. My sister Linda is married to a minister. They live up in Orange Cove, California, about 5-hour drive from here. My sister Marion works for the Palmdale school system. She lives in Wrightwood. I have a sister Cheryl who works for Casino Foods in Port Hueneme, California, and then my stepbrother Tom, he lives up in Carmichael, California. He's a minister of music at a church up there, but he now is in Frankfurt, Germany, teaching music there.
Were Roy and Dale both products of religious families? I mean, I can't imagine that they, in the vernacular, got religion all of a sudden, but during this whole time, you were saying grace at Thanksgiving and that kind of thing, there is a very strong tie that binds in this whole family, and I guess it had to have been there from the beginning.
Well, everybody had,
Plus, you've gone through a lot. Large families have that, but there have not always been good times.
No, we've had been tested by fire, as they say, with the loss of 3 children, and it's been a very difficult life for them off and on, but it's been a very rewarding life too. They have 27 grandchildren, and Dad's 81 now, and Mom's 80, and they're both still running and jumping and being able to do what they want to do. So.
Well, and by and large, if they didn't have the museum, if they didn't have the wonderful family and the interest of the public, it's safe to say they might not be around now. I mean, they've got a reason to be here and continue to be Roy and Dale and keep that up as long as they can.
Well, sure, we all need a reason to go to work every day, and of course, lately it's been just to pay the government, but we need a direction and a purpose in life, and theirs is, like Dad's legs have been bothering me, his hips been bothering him. I said, Dad, why don't you let me get you a pair of Rockports or something that you feel comfortable and doesn't bother your legs? He says, no. He says, I'm not going to wear them because when people come to the museum, he says, they don't expect to see me in walking shoes. They expect to see me in boots. So he's still keeping up the Roy Rogers. He says he comes down here every day to play old Roy, and he does. He comes in every day from about 9 to 11 to 12, somewhere in there, and then he goes home and watches the soap operas like everybody else. So.
Well, to go back to Gabby Hayes for a second, I remember at one of the Academy Awards in his later years, he was there with his teeth in a white tuxedo. And it was like it was Gabby Hayes, but it wasn't Gabby.
Right. Well, there's once somebody remembers you a certain way, to see you different than that is really a cultural shock.
Well, Dusty, this has been good fun and a great thrill, and as I say, you can't really do much in 25 minutes to something as spacious as this, but I know you're busy, and I want to thank you for taking the time.
Hey, I appreciate you coming by.
Sadly, the museum closed, and Dusty Rogers, remembering that his dad had said, one day all my fans will be dead, sold off most of the memorabilia. I'm Dennis Daly.